thank you, Nessa, for that lovely contextualisation of Tim's work. And as Cillian said, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Aisling and I'm one of the archivists here. I'm the digital archivist in NUIG. So I've been working on Tim's archive, listing it and initiating a digital visualisation and mapping project emanating from it. The focus of my talk is going to be to tell you about the archive, to convey a sense of its breadth and to show you some of the treasures within it while telling you about the work that's taken place on it so far. So as Nessa outlined there, the Robinson's archive arrived here in the library in late 2013, and fortunately it arrived just in time before we settled into a severe winter of floods and storms. It arrived here just in the nick of time. Perhaps the best way to begin describing it is as a rich and multidisciplinary working archive. It meticulously records the working documents and collected research of Tim and Mairead's 4 decades of work, with its broad themes being the mapping and interpretation of the landscape surrounding Galway Bay. What is notable are the methods used in carrying out the work and how its treatment of the landscape evolved through time. The archive is distinctive in a way that Tim and Mairead's own ethos and methodology were. So before we began work in the archive, we talked quite a bit with both Nessa and the Robinsons, and we decided to approach the cataloguing in 3 strands in order of accessibility. So the first priority was to look at the Townlands Index, which summarises a lot of the fieldwork in a collection of 7,000 index cards which describe the townlands of Connemara and the Aran Islands. The second priority was a collection of approximately 500 draft and research maps, which were the building blocks of the ABC of mapping the Aran, Burren and Connemara maps. And finally, the third priority, which is near completion, is the largest in volume, approximately 80 boxes of manuscript material, which chronologically dates from the 1960s, with material from Tim's time as a student in Cambridge, taking us through the arrival in the Aran Islands in the early 1970s and the camcourt or twisty journey that ensued over the following 40 or so years. So here's a photograph of the first section that we focused on, a beautifully self-contained sub-collection at the Townlands Index. So I'll begin the story with the story of its wooden container, which we discovered from Tim was actually enjoying something of a homecoming. It was gifted to him by our former university librarian, Mary Redden. Now, the original purpose of this piece would have been to store well-organised and clearly findable records of our library's bibliographical material. He repurposed it to house another type of index. So each drawer that you see here represents a civil parish in Connemara and the Aran Islands, and for each civil parish, a detailed description of its constituent townlands were neatly written, the information having been distilled from a combination of fieldwork and follow-up research. The Civil Parish Division works very well as an entry point into the archive. So by means of background, the Civil Parish is an intermediate geographical subdivision with multiple townlands per parish and multiple parishes per barony. The areas covered in the civil parishes were generally the same as in old Gaelic territorial subdivisions, but they became more formal following the Norman invasions and were formalised by the Elizabethans at the time of the plantations. The Down Survey in the 17th century mapped these areas as accurately as possible, and civil parishes came to have a use in local taxation and were represented in the 19th century Ordnance Survey maps. So although later on in the 19th century district electoral divisions and the establishment of county districts largely made civil parishes obsolete, the parishes were the basis upon which Griffith's valuation and other land and tax records were created in the 19th and 20th centuries. And these historical records were a really important source of information for Tim throughout his deep mapping project. So in that context, they're a logical system for organisation. So in total, there are 13 civil parishes represented here, with 567 constituent townlands described in just over 7,000 cards. The information on the cards has its origins in the weather-beaten field notebooks, which are also part of the archive. So they record the Irish and English language versions of the townland. They often include a musing on the origin of the name, a piece of contextual information about the townland, such as a landowner of note during the time of Griffith's evaluation, and then there's the detail, descriptions of historical, archaeological, ecclesiastical and geological significance, as well as occasional snatches of place and folklore. This collection of local knowledge is enriched with a note of the people who provided them with the information, so if not directly named, then described. And these would have been the people that Tim met while out conducting his fieldwork on the landscape. So some were keen to approach him, having been familiar with his work through a column that he wrote in the Connaught Tribune in the early 1980s. The column was a close-up of topography and place name lore, with articles which functioned as a research tool for Tim. So they stimulated local interest and prompted many readers to contribute further information about the places that they knew intimately, many of which would not otherwise have been recorded. So just to give you a little hint into the wonder and knowledge that's waiting to be uncovered upon further excavation into the archive, my eye was caught in cataloguing the townland of Thurinagospor, and sure enough there was a local lore on the origin of the name to be found. So I'm not sure how legible that is on the left hand side, but I'll read from it. A local story has it that a herd hand went into the woods there and was killed and eaten by a bull. All that was found of him were the boots with their feet still in them, hence Thurinagospor, or the woods of the cold feet. He credits local man Paddy Foley, his name is on the bottom right there, as being a local source of this information. So that's kind of an example of the type of thing that's there. Another example that caught my eye was Looking Freacon. So he records ambiguity between the common understanding of the townland being translated from an association with crows, so Freacon with PH, but another contradictory story that associates it with Freacon, spelled with an F, meaning blueberries, and referring to some that grow in the islands of the lake. So Robertson is clear to explain that Freacon with the PH is the more widely accepted interpretation, but he's characteristically meticulous in recording every other interpretation he has heard, making the archive as it exists a democratic and well-represented source of information. His sense of responsibility to preserve the landscape included a proclivity to recording rituals, traditions and stories and binding them to a sense of place, and thereby capturing the distinctiveness of the local landscapes. So the place name cards were transcribed from the notebooks that he had out on his field trips, which also reside in the archive, and these include illustrations of gravestones, flora and fauna, megaliths, coats of arms, many of which are slightly blurred with drops of rain or other evidence of the inclement weather conditions he was sure to have encountered. The information on the cards would have been summarised, cherry-picked, added to with reflections, and built upon to include contextual information. But the breadth of information on them will give you some indication of the magnitude of his deep mapping work. So as these were the first component of the archive to be catalogued, and because of their clear geographical layout, these cards were also treated as the foundation stone of the digital mapping project that we undertook. So you'll hear about that in more detail from Peter later on in the afternoon, but just to give you an idea, the geographical spread that's represented in these documents gave an opportunity to visually represent the range and subject materials of the archive. So the next part of the archive that we focused on were a collection of just under 500 research and draft maps, which formed the building blocks of the Arran, Burren Uplands and Connemara maps. So these include 19th century Admiralty charts, a comprehensive series of historical OS maps, along with detailed tracings and annotations of these, geological surveys, soil charts, artistic representations of the land, all of which have a clear evolution towards the folding landscapes maps. And they record every single townland that's represented in the index, along with several other features. So when updates to the maps were published, tracings from selected areas on the original maps were sent out to Tim's network of correspondents. So he'd ask them to add in any additional townlands or any additional features that they knew about or make any corrections that were necessary. And an example of that is not that clear there, but what you're looking at there is a tracing of the map, and a correspondent of his has added some pencil notations in, adding in different place names. Photographs of Tim carrying out his fieldwork on site further illustrate his methodology and the conditions that he worked in. And then the lion's share of the work, both Tim's and mine, is represented in 84 boxes that encompass his research work, his writing and his involvement in local ecological matters. So if we take them chronologically, they could be said to begin in Cambridge during his university days when Tim was a student of mathematics. So in letters home to his parents, he recounts the challenges of studying under the eccentric Professor Bisikovich, but mentions a concept new to him, that of the piano curve, which describes a continuous line that passes through every point in a unit square. The concept was highly influential in how Tim approached his mapping, as he sought to traverse every possible inch of the areas that he was mapping, either by foot or on bike. And he later wrote about the piano curve in a Connemara fractal in 1996. So the image on the left there is taken from the letter to his father, where he talks about his professor and the new concept. And the image on the right is an illustration of the piano curve. His work as an artist in Vienna and Istanbul, and community art projects that he was involved with in Hampstead in the late 1960s, also, as Nessa said, bear a clear relation to his deep mapping work, with an interactive art piece he designed called the Four-Colour Theorem. That contained around 150 elements of 4 different shapes, where spectators were invited to arrange and combine them as pleased them. So he describes it as, at first the elements are scattered at random, and then as they are moved about, areas of order will appear, grow and dissolve. The participants will build a landscape out of the given elements. So that was an interest of his even in the late 1960s. So following Tim and Mairead's life-changing visit to the Aran Islands, the archive material tells the story of their pioneering work and unfolds the landscape through a wide range of disciplines and talents that were at play throughout their careers. So extensive correspondence with writers, folklorists, botanists, Irish language experts, archaeologists and geologists. This section of the archive dispenses a further layer in the evolution of Tim's deep mapping work. An integral part of his ethos is preservation, and Tim has written, quote, "That is one function of my work, this translation of the dense web of place lore out of speech and memory and into the world of books and maps, and it is a troubling aspect of the enterprise," end quote. The coastal regions and topographical features that are the subject of his maps are inseparable from the influence exerted on them by time, and perhaps the most explicit evidence of his ethos is in Folding Landscape's winning entry to the Ford European Conservation Prize in the late 1980s. So their portfolio for this is part of the archive, and it provides a succinct representation of the work they carry out to that date, in which Tim describes as a study in how humans can intelligently and lovingly dwell in the human habitat. He describes the Western landscapes as being the perfect field in which to play with such ideals, and the quote there, "The Aran Islands and Burren are limestone karst areas that have been scraped bare by glaciations. Everything that has ever happened to them is legible on the ground underfoot. The rock formations, fossils, remains of countless tombs and forts from the Stone Age and Celtic Iron Age. Then the Aran Islands and South Connemara are the principal strongholds of the Irish language, and their folklore and place-name lore is probably richer than any other in Western Europe. Theirs is an oral culture, reaching back in unbroken continuity to the Celtic heroic age. All these areas are famous for their flora and rare ecosystems, such as the lowlands blanket bog and lakelands near Roundstone." So the winning portfolio presented a bibliography of Folding Landscape's output to date, which included the Aran and Burren maps, the first of the Stones Barron books, a pamphlet of 2 essays entitled Setting Foot on the Shores of Connemara, in which he expressed the experience of walking the entire length of the convoluted coastline of South Connemara. It also described his work on roadside cenotaphs and cairns dating from the 18th and 19th centuries, with detailed descriptions of each funerary monument, complete transcriptions, and a very representative selection of photographs. And he also outlined his forthcoming Connemara map and guide, which he described as the most ambitious of the 3 projects he'd undertaken. Community initiatives such as the Campaign to Save Roundstone Bog, research in fish farms in the west of Ireland, kelp and seaweed harvesting, the local knitwear industry, land use wind farms, these are just some examples of the subjects on which there are detailed research material included, all framed in the context of the landscape of the west of Ireland. Robinson once wrote, "To explore an island is to court obsession, and his manuscript material certainly bears this fastidiousness out. He is meticulous in recording authoritative information, and having encountered a brief reference to a shipwreck off Inishbofin in 1779, he begins an obsessive search for authoritative information that the name of the ship was the Royal Oak, and on the origin of the ship. And similarly, he investigates famine relief in Connemara with comparable diligence, and seeks to find out as much as possible about the Burridge family of Ballynahinch, of whom comparably little was known than of the Martin family, who sold off their estate in 1849. So he traces a descendant of the Burridges, who's similarly intrigued, and a lengthy correspondence exchanging their new findings is born. And the findings are summarised into a single place name card for Ballynahinch, making a succinct entry point into the archive. So that's kind of an example of how accessible that particular part of it is. The archive also includes some of the valuable research work of Mairead, who carried out a study on Aran knitting practices. In her research, she looked at knitting as an important cottage industry and a highly developed craft that descends directly from the Celtic past, both in its elaborate stitches and the oral transmission of knowledge of the stitches. So her work involved conducting interviews with individuals and groups, research on the history of the craft. She recorded craft techniques and artefacts. So there's 2 notebooks that record her interviews, in which the people that she interviewed talked about when they learned to knit, what it meant to them economically, their personal recollections of it, and really rich material there. One thing that has struck me in working on this archive is that the research was conducted largely in a time when such research required travel and a lot of preparation. The way that Tim organised his research is interesting in itself, with hurried notes taken from the 1901 or 1911 census or Griffith's valuation that would have been taken in haste, and these pop up quite a bit in the archive. And these are resources that are now freely available online, which is a feature of research that Tim longs for audibly in much of his work. It's apparent from the manuscript section of the archive that the Robinsons always intended to make as much of their archive as possible available digitally, so it is a pleasure to be able to pursue this. So, as well as listing, preserving and making the material physically available, we've also sought to represent it digitally online, both in order to extend its reach to a wider audience and to encourage multidisciplinary engagement with both the archive and the landscape. The digital project so far has focused on the Townlands Index, and the initial aim is to create a visual narrative that clearly represents the archive in an engaging and accessible way. So I'll come to an end soon. A few people are owed a debt of thanks for their work in the archive. Nell Buckley was the person who has done the digitalisation work to date, and she worked with us on a studentship in the summer of 2015 with thanks to Nessa. And Killian Joy has done a huge amount of work on the digital mapping project as well. The Artists in the Archive project, which was initiated by Nessa, takes us in another revolutionary direction which explores ways of engaging with the archive. So I think Nessa's going to talk a bit about that now, so I will conclude with that.